All right, church. Well, 1980s week. I was born in 1983. I think the 80s was a weird time. I didn't spend, only 7 years in the 80s, but it was a strange time. Weird time, I think. As we move into the message this morning, we're going to talk a little bit about waiting today. Waiting. It seems to me that there is nothing more frustrating to people than a delay. Delayed flights, delayed deliveries, delayed opportunities, delayed love, all frustrating. Us people really hate when anything in our world is deferred or postponed or rescheduled. Now, sometimes delays are actually a legitimate problem and a legitimate frustration because there's something on the other end that is significantly interrupted or impacted by this delay, and so then frustration is warranted. But oftentimes delays are despised simply because it means we have to wait. That's really the only problem, and we hate it. We really hate waiting. In my 39 years on earth, I don't think I have met anyone who I would say is really good at waiting. Seems none of us are. And waiting, interestingly, isn't a one-size-fits-all experience. Though waiting is common to all of us, how we wait seems to be unique, person to person. Waiting has a personality. Waiting has a character, depending on who the one is that's doing the waiting. There's no such thing, in my experience, maybe you disagree, but there's no such thing as indifferent waiting. We all wait one way or another. And so waiting can be patient or impatient, can be anxious or peaceful, can be hopeful or despairing. Waiting can be excited or it can be dreadful. Waiting can be with a sense of control or that we feel very out of control. Waiting can be angry. Waiting can be forgiving. Waiting is an inevitable part of life. But how we wait, that is in fact ours to determine. And so today's song is about waiting. And it just so happens that this is one of my very favorite songs of all time. In fact, this is not the first time that I've mentioned it in a sermon here in this church. Today's song is the Tom Petty and the Heartbreakers hit, The Waiting. The Waiting was released in 1981 as the first single on the album Hard Promises. The song peaked at number 19 on the Billboard Hot 100, and it went to number 1 on Billboard Magazine's new chart at the time, the Rock Tracks chart, and it held down the number 1 spot there for 6 straight weeks during the summer of 1981. Tom Petty claims that the inspiration for this song came from something he heard Janis Joplin say one time. It's a funny story because Roger McGuinn, who's one of the famous Byrds, argued that no, he told Tom Petty this line that inspired this song. But Petty claims it was Janis Joplin who was making a comment on the space in between performances, that it was all just waiting, essentially, to get back on the stage. The song itself, according to Petty, is about, and I quote him now, waiting for your dreams and not knowing if they will come true. He says, I've always felt that it was an optimistic song. In the months before my family and I moved to Yellowknife to pastor this church, the anticipation was significant. We were excited. We felt like we had a great big adventure in front of us. And Tom Petty's song, The Waiting, became almost like an anthem for that season. When I remember those days, this is the song that kind of comes to mind without fail. This is the song I was listening to before just getting to know you folks. So, with that being said, it's time to hear the song. Now, what we're going to hear today is a little bit of a hybrid because this is a 2006 performance, but this performance is special because we're going to dip into the 90s a little bit, and Eddie Vedder from Pearl Jam is going to join Tom Petty on stage and sing this song, most of the lyrics anyways, and do a great job. So with that being said, Here is Tom Petty and the Heartbreakers, The Waiting. I don't know too many other pastors who have played Eddie Vedder 2 times in the same church, but I now boast that distinction. I love the opening line of that song, "Baby, don't it feel like heaven right now? Don't it feel like something from a dream?" When a long wait is over, it's a powerful experience because waiting is often a challenge, a struggle, a long wrestling match with a number of things. And when the wait finally ends, that is how it can feel, like heaven, like a dream. And I think anyone who's anticipated something coming to pass can relate to the experience then of this song. Certainly the satisfaction of the waiting coming to an end, but also the experience of waiting itself. As I've already said, waiting is incredibly hard. And there's no waiting more difficult than waiting for God to show us what He's doing. Waiting for God's answer is often, to borrow from Petty, the hardest part of faith. But like any waiting, how we wait is up to us when we wait on God or wait for God to move, however we want to describe this. And as I said, our waiting has a character, and so we can wait in weakness or in strength. We can wait in misery or we can wait in hope. The choice is ours. And the character then of that waiting is something that the 40th chapter of Isaiah addresses. And so if you have your Bibles, I'll invite you to turn to Isaiah chapter 40. Isaiah chapter 40. Before we jump into our specific passage, let me give you the context for what we're going to look at today. The audience being addressed in this passage are the Hebrews. It's God's people, and they are confused as to what God is up to. They're feeling weak. They're feeling helpless. They are likely at this point facing the military threat of an attack from the Assyrians and King Sennacherib. Possibly Isaiah's speaking to some of the Babylonian captives who are wrestling with their faith. I think it makes more sense that he's speaking to a military threat. We don't know for sure because they don't actually tell us specifically what's being addressed. But what we know for certain is that they're waiting for God and they're feeling very discouraged. And the character of their waiting could use some help, which the prophet Isaiah offers. So we're going to pick up towards the end of the chapter in verse 27, and we're going to read through 31. This should be familiar, that is, to most of you, as it is famous. Isaiah says, "Why do you complain, Jacob? Why do you say, Israel, my way is hidden from the Lord? My cause is disregarded by my God. Do you not know? Have you not heard? The Lord is the everlasting God, the creator of the ends of the earth. He will not grow tired or weary, and his understanding no one can fathom. He gives strength to the weary and increases the power of the weak. Even youths grow tired and weary, and young men stumble and fall, but those who hope in the Lord will renew their strength. They will soar on wings like eagles. They will run and not grow weary. They will walk and not be faint." It could be argued that this is one of the most famous passages in all the Bible. It is beloved. It's used in art. It's quoted from memory. It's inscribed on the bookmarks we get from our grandmother when we graduate. And it's hung upon the walls of homes and churches. Isaiah 40 is loved because the promise of care found within the character of God is so needed by so many people in many different generations who find themselves waiting for God to do something. This passage, I think, is beloved because it gives us a blueprint for the character of our waiting. It gives us a description. It gives us a standard. It gives us something to aspire to, inspiration for the experience of waiting. It doesn't just assure us that everything will be okay. It gives us a way to wait while that answer is still being delivered. What you'll notice in this little section this morning is that in Isaiah 40, you never even really get the solution to the problem. You just get what you do while you're waiting. And so our first point this morning is this, that while we are waiting, God shouldn't be the cause of complaint. Isaiah asks, why do you complain, Jacob? Why do you say, Israel, my way is hidden from the Lord, my cause is disregarded by my God? Why do you complain and why do you say? If you have ever stood in a long line or had a flight delayed, if you've ever waited for your spouse to make up their mind, the difficult experience that is waiting can often lead us to complain. And when we complain, it's directed at someone or something. We believe that if that person or if that system was more effective, then we wouldn't have to wait like this. I find it interesting that people never have more bursts of creative thought and problem-solving solutions than when standing in line for something. Right? Have you found this to be true in your own life? We have the idea no one has ever thought of when we're standing in long lines. Now, when it comes to complaining while we're waiting, I'm sure you've noticed that oftentimes then God becomes the object of complaint. Amazingly, I think because God doesn't really defend himself. He just lets us do it. He's big enough to take it. He's not offended by it. He's not scared. He thinks, so I think at times we're nuts. But sure, go on, blame me. And the complaint isn't necessarily that God is always the cause of our problem. I don't think we go that far, that God is doing this to me. Rather, the complaint is that he is the cause of our waiting, that the solution isn't coming quicker, that he's allowing us to wait. That's what we get irritated about. And this is what Israel is doing in this moment. They're expressing that God wasn't getting them out of the situation. They're not necessarily complaining about the situation itself, but that God seems to not see or care. God, of course, is believed to be a covenant-keeping God. He's their God. They're his people. He's been a powerful deliverer. He's been a provider, a sustainer for their parents and their grandparents and their great-grandparents. But for this generation, none of that seems true anymore. And so the people are left lamenting that God does not see us or care. They aren't accusing God of being the author of evil. They're just lamenting that his mercy seems far. And that they must go on waiting for the difficulty to either pass on its own or for God, I guess, to eventually do something, whatever comes first. And to this complaint then of God's people, Isaiah asks two questions. He says, why do you complain and why do you say that God doesn't see or that my way is disregarded, that God doesn't care? You know, Isaiah's questions here are really almost a statement to us, aren't they? Sometimes I find in these beautiful Old Testament books, the poetry almost conceals the frankness of what's being communicated. And I think that that's taking place here. Through his questions, the prophet is saying to God's people, do you really think that your complaint is rational? Do you really think what you're saying makes any sense? Do you really think that it makes sense to continue to believe that Yahweh, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, doesn't see you or care? And through his questions, Isaiah tells Israel then that their complaint and their lament is in fact misguided. They may have reason to feel down. They may have 1,000 reasons to feel low. But God not seeing or God not caring, well, that's not it at all. Because he most certainly does. And so the simple takeaway from verse 27 as we move into the rest of this passage is this. When we are stuck for an answer, when we are waiting for a breakthrough, and the waiting is getting to be unbearable, we want to be sure that the character of our waiting isn't one that complains that God is blind or indifferent, that God could somehow have those in his character, blind and indifferent, especially to the situation of people who he has made and loves. And not even because this could be considered, disrespectful to accuse God of such things or that it's unbecoming of a child of God and we should just know better, thus behave better. We don't want to complain or lament like this because it's just actually completely irrational. And I think that generally when we act irrationally, in every other area of life, well, good often doesn't come from that. We don't see truth come from irrationality. We don't see good behavior come from irrationality. It usually leads to chaos and breakdown and disruption and more anger, and things get worse, not better, when we get irrational. And so the better way is to wait with rational thoughts, rational thinking, and rational conclusions about those things which we can know and those things which we can understand. Interestingly, one of such things is in fact God, which is where Isaiah then goes with all of this. And Isaiah begins to give his audience a rational perspective that will give a new character to the people's waiting. And so what Isaiah reminds them of is this, that remembrance is more powerful than complaint. When we are waiting, remembrance is more powerful than complaint. Here's some more questions. Do you not know? Have you not heard? The Lord is the everlasting God, the creator of the ends of the earth. He will not grow tired or weary, and his understanding no one can fathom. When we are stuck waiting for God to move, the habit is to focus only on exactly what we're facing. We get kind of put in within the lines of our problem, and we can't really get out of that zone. We see our problem, we see our inconvenience, we see our life's disruption, and then in the case of waiting on God, we see what is perceived to be his inaction. But notice that the prophet actually moves the audience's focus away from their moment. He doesn't talk about the threat, he doesn't talk about the problem. That's why we don't even know what exactly it was. And he takes their present complaint and he places it on the past, in the past, on what is certain and known about God. And it's this intentional redirection from their little moment into the God of all eternity that provides the answer to the question, does God see or does God care? So what does Isaiah tell them? He says remembrance is more powerful than complaint by asking them two rhetorical questions. Do you not know? And have you not heard? Isaiah knows that they do know and that they have heard. He's not asking because they have. In fact, they have. And so he's saying, how come you're talking like this? You already know and you've already heard. That's really what he's getting at. Isaiah knows that their past experiences teaching Torah and the countless words of God's prophets from guys like Isaiah over the years have given this generation more than enough information to understand who God is and why he isn't blind, why he isn't indifferent to their situation. And then in this incredibly poetic way, Isaiah stirs up the remembrance. What a powerful ministry to stir up remembrance of what people already know, of what people knew to be true one time before. And to come into this place of rationality before God and begin to challenge this lament that God doesn't see or care. And so what does Isaiah do in this poetic moment? First of all, he says that God is the everlasting God. This means that God does not have a start and God does not have an end. And if God has no start and God has no end, then there is nothing in all of history or in the future that is not under his watch. There is nothing that God has not seen and there is nothing he cannot see, including those who currently feel that they are being unseen and disregarded. Next, the prophet declares God is the creator of the whole earth and everything that is in it, which means he's sovereign and he is in control of all people, not just Israel, but all people. Unlike those pagan gods or those household idols that had a little boundary or a little place of influence, Yahweh's rule has no geographic restriction. It has no boundary in heaven or on earth. God is aware of his people, but God is also aware of their enemies. Next, Isaiah says God's power to oversee every single star and every single person never for one moment causes him to feel tired or worn out. God is always at his best, we could say. He needs no naps. He needs no days off. He doesn't need a holiday from his governance because now he's just worn out from this. There is no moment where his perfection or his strength stops There's no moment where the source or the flow just gets cut off for a second or two. It is consistent perfectly from every generation. No problem is too great for him to solve, including what these people are facing. And finally, Isaiah declares that God's wisdom is unlimited and it is totally beyond anything a human mind can even come close to understanding. Therefore, there's no circumstance or seemingly random act of humanity outside of his ability to rule over. God most certainly then understands what they're going through. It's not as if this is the one thing on earth that is now too complex for him to get his mind around. He can't understand the inner workings. It's not confusing for him. And so to put this all together, to Israel's complaint that God doesn't see or care, Isaiah says that's ludicrous. It's insane. It's not even possible for him to not see or care, is what he's saying. He could not see and not care. Because God's very nature, very character, very power is such that he's involved in every single time period, in every location in the universe, in every single detail of every life. And he has perfect understanding of all things, past, present, future, eternal. Perfect understanding. And you see, church, what Isaiah is declaring then to Israel is the power of remembrance when being forced to wait on God. He invites them to consider what they already know about God, what they've known before. Go back to it and reflect on what they have seen and what they've heard about him. Because if they do this, they can't help but let go of that complaint. Because it doesn't make sense anymore. They can't exist together. They can't continue to lament that God's blind and indifferent when they're declaring that he's the everlasting God whose power and understanding has no limit. And so there may be many reasons why they're in that difficult situation, but it's not God's weakness or his neglect or his injustice or a failure to really understand what they're going through that's created this circumstance for them. And for us then, what we should see in all of this is that looking backwards to what God has done for us, for our friends, for our family, in our church, and what we have heard that he has done by reading the pages of our Bible, that can actually change the character of our waiting. As long as we determine to wait in such a way that we never consider anything beyond the circumstance, then our waiting is going to be hard. And it'll be long. And it will be limited to that moment. And it will be full of irrational questions, full of irrational conclusions. But when we look outside of that moment and that circumstance that's caused the waiting, and we look to the evidence in our life and in these descriptions of the nature and the power of God, then we go from complaining in weakness to hoping in strength. And I say hoping in strength because Isaiah doesn't simply then just describe God's action in the past. He also assures those who are weary and waiting that the God of the past, who is not blind or indifferent, is also the God of the moment, the God of the present, the God with them right now. And his strength is available to sustain even in the most challenging of circumstances. Now, we love the sound of that, but there's a key to receiving that strength. And I actually think this is really maybe the most important part of this message. How do we tap into that strength that we're going to look at here? Well, Isaiah tells us that the key to receiving God's strength is our hope. God's strength, you see, is actually accessed through our hope in him. He says that he gives strength to the weary and he increases the power of the weak. Youths grow tired and weary and young men stumble and fall, but those who hope in the Lord will renew their strength. They will soar on wings like eagles. They will run and not grow weary. They will walk and not be faint. So in my experience, and maybe you have found this to be true in your life, you can get into these moments where you're waiting, and well-intentioned and God-loving people will remind you of God's strength. And it'll sound really good. And maybe for that moment, you'll even believe that that strength is coming your way. and that tomorrow or tonight or whenever, you'll begin to know that strength. God can give me that strength. And then all of a sudden you realize, I don't feel any stronger. Seems like maybe the strength didn't come as I was told it would be. And it feels like then God's strength is a rumor or something available to other people, but it's not necessarily available to you. God's strength is this sort of like hit and miss thing. Sometimes it lands on you, sometimes it misses. And I think a lot of people live like this. Because a loved one spoke of God's strength, and you think now you're just guaranteed that you'll know it. Because someone manifested it with their words in your presence. But this isn't what Isaiah says at all. He says that those who hope in the Lord will renew their strength. He doesn't say that those who heard rumors of God's strength feel stronger. He says that those who place their hope in God. Not those who just hear, but those who actively participate. And you see, then it is possible to want God's strength, but never actually come to the place that we put our hope in Him. And this is why then we get left feeling like God doesn't see or God doesn't care, and that His strength is a rumor, because our hope actually hasn't been placed in God. Hoping in the Lord is key to knowing God's renewing strength. So we ask then, what does it mean to hope in the Lord? What is hope? How do we hope? Is hope a wish? Is hope a complimentary thought? Is hope an unofficial prayer? What does it mean to hope? Well, hoping in God first means ceasing to count on yourself. Hoping in God means relinquishing your right to be in charge of your resolution. Hoping in the Lord is coming to accept that you really desperately need God and not like 1,000 other things that you've been collecting. And you know what? That is really easy to say. I hope in God. Even speaking to you right now, I suspect that most of you go, well, yeah, I do that. I hope in the Lord. I've hoped in the Lord for 37 years. Way harder to do because there are almost endless people and endless places that we like to put our hope. There are almost endless people and endless places asking us to lay our hope upon them, and we do it. In fact, I would suggest that uncovering what we are hoping in, really uncovering where our hope is, it's not a quick process. Because there are people and places that we have placed our hope, and we don't even know that we're hoping in them. We've built such habits and systems of hoping in that thing or that person or that experience or that conclusion or that's just the way it works, that we have hope all over the place. We don't even know where we left it. It's scattered so far and wide. Or we have places where we're hoping, but we don't necessarily want to admit that that's actually what we're hoping in. We keep it to ourselves. And then we wonder why we don't feel this renewing strength. And then I think that there are also places that we just prefer to place our hope. That's just our habitual hoping place. When I get feeling like this, then I hope here, or I hope there. And those scattered hopes are really what prevent us from truly hoping in the Lord in such a way that we know a renewing strength. Hoping in the Lord is about recognizing that we can't actually do it, that we can't do it in our strength, we can't do it in our wisdom, we can't do it in our consistency, we can't do it with our bank account, we can't do it with the right connections, we can't do it based on our reputation. You ever think about how much energy and how much strength we waste looking for locations to place our hope that aren't God? How much energy we waste looking to hope in places and trust places and count on places and people that aren't God. You have spent more time lying awake at night wondering where you can lay your hope than we would care to admit, as have I. And we wake up and we don't feel any stronger. Hoping is recognizing that we need God more than all these other things, and recognizing all those other things that we thought we needed more than God. Additionally, hoping means depending on God entirely. Entirely. And it's more than just admitting it or saying the words, oh, I depend on God. Dependence becomes the character of the waiting. Really becomes the character, because hope is coming to confidently, and I really mean that, confidently, look to God's timing, God's plan, rather than our own. Confident hope. And so if we put this together, then we can define hope like this. Placing our hope in God means we confess our helplessness, and we commit ourselves completely into the hands of God who holds all power. That's hope. So when it comes to determining the character of our waiting, our invitation is to take seriously the words of Isaiah, who points to this confident, strong hope as the character of waiting, rather than the character that is offering up these irrational conclusions that God doesn't see or care. And it's this hopeful character of waiting then that allows us to actually have this renewable strength that comes in surprising ways when no one would think we would be strong. There it is. The kind of strength that becomes testimony, the kind of strength that points others to God, the kind of strength that gives glory to his name. And other people observe it and say, man, I can't believe how strong you were in that season. Or I'm so impressed by your strength. I don't think I would have that if I was going through what you're going through. That is what it looks like to depend and hope in God with a renewing strength. When we run, and we don't get tired, and we walk, and our legs don't get weak, and we in fact soar as if we were on wings. So Tom Petty's saying waiting is the hardest part. But I wonder if that's not actually the case. It seems to me how we wait determines how hard it will be. I don't mean to suggest that waiting is ever easy. I mean, I think it's the common human problem that just makes us frustrated. But I do think how we wait determines how hard it will be. Isaiah reminds us today, just as he did his original audience, that when it comes to waiting, God is more than capable of making it more than bearable. And so it's God's character then that I want to zoom in on just for a moment as we wrap this message up. You know, I said this last week, and I'm going to say it again, but in these messages, it's so easy to make the application all about us, or even all about our difficult circumstance. But that's not what Isaiah does here. He actually doesn't comment, like I said, on their problem. He doesn't even really comment on them. And I don't want to do that either. What Isaiah does is he talks about God. He points to God. He speaks about God's character and what we know to be true about this God. And so I want to bring this message to a close by sharing a quote that speaks to the God whose power we access through hope. This is by a guy named Gary Smith, who's just a Bible commentator. Speaking of God, he says, his power is unfathomable. His realm of influence is unlimited. His wisdom has no limits. This means that every person can know for certain that God is able to control every aspect of this world. Even today, hope is based on a solid foundation of what God has done in the past. Therefore, trusting in God for the future makes sense. When trials and doubts arise, the people of God today must return to the foundation of their faith, the character of God that is revealed in Scripture. It pictures a great God who is worthy of trust. So waiting is hard, but I have to disagree with Mr. Petty. It's not the hardest part. The hardest part is waiting as if God was blind or indifferent. So we praise God today that regardless of what we are waiting for, we are never, ever, ever outside of his caring gaze and his able hands.